Hello, this is the fourth instalment of the introductory overview to different forms of paganism, and me multitasking again in the kitchen. If anyone's remotely interested, this time I'm making quince jam ready for the Christmas season, and rhubarb gin ready for me to get completely bladdered at one of the weekends coming up in the not too distant future. And frankly, after my journey today on Berlioz trains, I need to get completely bladdered. It was not pleasant, but there we go. Anyway, said last time that we would talk a little bit about just this. There we go. Ethics. That's the word I'm looking for, and the understanding of ethics in paganism. First off, there isn't a single understanding of ethics in paganism. There's a multiplicity of ideas and beliefs. As ever, nothing is ever quite as straightforward as you might wish it to be. But yeah, that's fine. It's largely because there's so many different types and varieties and branches of paganism that each one has its own slightly different take on the subject. The one probably most people who are loosely interested in paganism are familiar with is something called the Wiccan Rede. Rede in this case meaning a set of laws or guidance, not the plant growing at the river's edge. The Wiccan Rede, there are slight variations in exactly how it goes, but the general gist is, if it harm none, do as you will. Sometimes phrased in slightly more poetic language than that, but that's the common gist of it. It, as a concept, it sort of goes back to people like Rabelais and so on, who argued for what is fundamentally a libertarian approach to ethics, to say that nothing should be out of bounds unless it is harmful. As what is basically a very short, usually 8 words, creed, it sounds dead simple, it sounds very straightforward, it sounds very kind of neat and manageable. And when it was coined, Doreen Valiente, author of pagan books, back in the 60s and 70s and 80s and so forth, she was quite prolific with her books. She suggested, towards the later stage of her life, that a chap called Gerald Gardner, with whom she had been very closely associated, they'd belonged in the same pagan groups for a period of time, they'd studied with each other and so forth. She suggested that Gerald Gardner was the primary instigator of the Rede, and arguably one of the reasons why he wanted to introduce something like that was as a contrast to the much more familiar Ten Commandments of Christianity, and by extension things like the many commandments in Leviticus, where you tend to get a long list of things saying you must not do this, you must do that. Gerald Gardner, like quite a lot of people who were coming into paganism at that time, was to an extent anti-establishment, in that he wanted to see something freer, easier, more accessible, more intelligible, rather than a big long list of what he saw as fairly authoritarian, very strict, rather inhibiting forms of morality. Obviously, that's not a view that most Christians would take of the Ten Commandments, or most Jewish people, but that's the way that quite a lot of non-Christian people, non-Jewish people, tend to experience the way it's sort of put across in practice, especially if you've got one of those fire and brimstone type preachers or vicars, ministers, what have you, who can often come across as very harsh and judgmental. So the Rede is meant to be much more relaxed. It sounds, as I said, quite straightforward, quite simple. If you apply your brain to it to any extent, it becomes rather more complex than it looks at first sight. So if you take the idea of harming none, the next question, if you're going to be all meta-ethical, as it were, and start analysing things, is to ask the question, what constitutes harm? There's obvious examples, shooting people, stabbing people, punching people, etc. is all fairly obviously harmful. But equally is chain smoking harmful? I mean, obviously most doctors would say yes, it is. It's harmful to the body. And then you're thinking of things like passive smoking. If you're going to smoke and harm your own body, do you smoke around other people and potentially harm their bodies? Awful lot of pagans I've met do smoke and do drink. It's quite a common sort of set of indulgences. And probably, I imagine, when Gerald Gardner was thinking up the whole "and it harm none," he wasn't thinking in the context of stuff like smoking. Medical knowledge of the impact of smoking was slightly more limited in his day than it is these days, for one thing. But also, he wasn't looking for something, a morality that was inhibiting of pleasure. He was looking for something that would embrace the idea of pleasure and joy and sensuality and enjoying good food, good drink, whatever else takes your fancy in that sense. So there are examples of behaviours where it's debatable if something is harmful. And then you have the sort of grey edge areas. A dentist obviously yanking someone's teeth out as such is harming them, the pain, the blood, etc. But obviously the harm caused by a dentist is instrumental harm, and it's a short-term measure, a short-term suffering to bring about a greater healing of that person's rotten teeth and gum diseases and what have you. Most people going to a dentist accept it's probably going to be painful and unpleasant, but they are willing to endure that to be free in the longer term of pain. Surgeons likewise, if they are opening somebody up with a scalpel, I mean technically slicing somebody open is clearly a fairly harmful thing to do, but we all accept that surgeons aren't doing it out of malice or anything like that. This is the infliction of a short-term pain for a greater good. Most people would accept that. And that's obviously not really what the read is getting at, but you've got to consider in that sense there are other forms of short-term pain that some people might say are for a greater long-term good, and other people might argue the toss over. So take an example of a parent smacking a child. Some people say, oh, it's violence, it's smacking, you mustn't do it, it's harmful, it's setting a bad example, and so on and so forth. An irate parent might say, I would sooner cause a short-term harm of a bit of a slap to the child now if it prevents some greater harm happening later, the child sticking its fingers in the plug socket or running out into a busy road or whatever it might be that the child has done, or even moral character, in the sense that a lot of parents might say, well, I'd sooner my child be upset now from a slap than grow up to be a terrible, horrible, awful person later if their behaviour goes unchecked. Is it harmful? Well, to an extent, yes it is. In the grand scheme of things, it's a fairly low-grade harm, but nonetheless, does it bring about a greater good? Well, that's where it gets ambiguous. We can be reasonably in agreement that dentistry and surgery are bringing about a greater good, by and large, but how best to discipline a child and other forms of painful interventionist activities, do they bring about a greater good? Clearly, when it comes to stuff like smacking children and related things, people can have quite varied and mixed views on that, and sometimes be adamantly against each other's definitions of what's harmful, what's to the greater good, what's not, and so forth. So it's not a wholly clear-cut matter, which is the first thing to bear in mind. Another aspect to reflect on and consider is the second part, and it harm none. That word none. By and large, it's likely that Gardner was thinking simply in terms of running around hurting other people. Fairly straightforwardly. But do we take it, or at least those pagans who adhere to this particular moral guideline, do we take it that that refers to only harming other people? What about self-harm? So going back to the smoking, or someone who wants to drink like a fish, or engage in dangerous contact sports that might leave them with broken bones and injuries. Is it their right to harm their body? What about things like piercings and tattooing, which is a form of harm to the body? I've got a tattoo. It's something I'm quite happy with, but obviously there are different religions in the world, people of different philosophical outlooks who would constitute jabbing needles into your skin and the rest of it as a form of harm. It's probably not what Gardner was thinking of, but then the other side of this is whatever was going through Gardner's mind, this has now become a moral maxim by which many, many Wiccans and other types of pagans live, irrespective of what Gardner may or may not have been thinking about back in the 50s. So it's gone beyond him. He no longer has a sort of ownership over this moral guideline. It's the genie is out of the bottle on that one. What about meat eating? Does harm none only extend to human beings? What about harming sheep or cows or goats or anything else that somebody might want to eat? What about taking your dog to the vet if the poor thing needs to be put down? There's all sorts of harms we engage in, both directly, as in taking your dog to the vet, or getting your dog neutered or something in that way, but also indirectly, as in paying a slaughterman to bump off a cow or a pig so that we can go to the shop and buy the meat. Is that harmful? Should people who adhere to the Wiccan Rede all be vegetarians, or indeed vegans for that matter? What about the harm caused by some plants in things like palm oil? Somebody like me who eats far too many sweets, some of which are made with palm oil that's grown in other countries where mass deforestation takes place, endangering all sorts of local wildlife, so that farmers can grow acre upon acre upon acre of palm oil so that greedy lumps like me can stuff their face with sweets. Is that harmful? Well, a lot of people would say yes. So it's not harmful to humans per se. The farmers are making a living, but it's certainly harmful to the land, to native plant life, to native animals. And again, is harm none extending not only to other humans, not to other humans, but also to other animals, other species, and perhaps to plant life? If I want to chop down a tree, am I harming some? How far do you take that? I'm not about to offer you an answer to any of those questions, because these are things that each pagan person must reflect upon if they adhere to that particular read and find the answers in themselves. Arguably, there are no objectively provable answers, so you will get some Wiccans who are vegetarian and some who are omnivorous, and one interprets it as meaning you can't harm cattle and so forth, and the other will interpret it that it only really applies to humans and doesn't extend to other species. Both can offer good arguments for their case. Is one person right? Is one person wrong? Well, hopefully from some of the previous podcasts you would have got the gist that within the pagan religions there is no real sense of moral exclusivity, of there being only one true way to answer any particular moral dilemma. There are a multitude of different views and understandings around the notion of what is right and what is wrong, to start with, which can get complicated at times, admittedly. I'm making a right mess of this. I'm getting sugar everywhere. That's an example of one pagan standard, one pagan approach to the matter of ethics and morality. Within heathenry, they have a different approach, heathenry being the forms of paganism that trace back to Scandinavian countries, to Germanic countries and so forth. The Anglo-Saxons worship of deities like Odin and Freya and Frigga and so forth. There was not, in that period of history when that religion was extant and commonplace in those parts of the world, there was not a carved-in-stone moral code that all devotees of Thor and Hela and Valder and so on adhered to. So we can't look back to a period in history and say, carved upon this tablet of stone is this moral code. What you've got are lots of poetic kennings, things like the Havamál, which is this quite long poem that's meant to be the words of the god Odin talking about advice on how to be a good host, how to be a good guest, what to do if you're out travelling, if you meet people. Some of it, by modern standards, is really rather sexist and outdated. Other parts of it, like the bit about being good hosts and good guests, are still very constant. And then you've got all of the myths and the legends and the lore, a lot of which have commonly repeated themes to them around things like honourable behaviour. So a lot of modern day heathens have basically looked at the ancient myths and tried to come up with some kind of cohesive code. One particular group of American heathens came up with a set of 9 principles, which many heathens go along with, but by no means all. There are others who say you don't need to reduce it down to a particular set, because you can just read the stories for yourself and divine your own interpretations. Which either direction people go in, it tends to emphasise things like personal honour, taking personal responsibility, responsible hedonism, so you seek your own pleasures in life, but you try to make sure you're not ruining anyone else's life in the process of you having a nice time. A lot of the quotes in things like Havamál are about moderation. So I know that the common TV image of ancient Vikings is big airy men swigging beer and passing out under the table. But actually a lot of the Havamál talks about drinking in moderation, so you don't make a fool of yourself, that you don't get into unnecessary fights, that you don't cause problems, you don't upset your host, you don't do this, you don't do that. About being a good, responsible guest, which kind of counteracts that TV cinematic image. A lot of modern heathens try to adhere to that. You do get ones who will drink an awful lot of beer and pass out under the table, in all fairness, but others will go for a more moderate approach to life. So it's variable in that way. We know that the ancient Germanic and Scandinavian cultures ate a fair amount of meat. There is lots of accounts of serving up wild roast boar and all of that kind of thing for feasts and banquets. So clearly the vast majority weren't vegetarian. Does that mean, because people 2,000, 1,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago or longer ate meat, that therefore 21st century heathens have to be omnivorous? Or do we place this in some element of context and say, well, that worked for people back then, other things may work for people now? There are vegan and vegetarian heathens about in the world. They're not all sitting there stuffing their face on wild roast boar every night. So you get a mixture of people who, either for health reasons or because they're worried about animal welfare, or they just don't like the taste, or they object to the scale of slaughter because literally billions and billions and billions of farm animals are killed every year for human consumption. And sadly a fair amount of it ends up in the bin because we are a very wasteful species. By and large we chuck an awful lot away rather than consuming it all as our distant ancestors would have done, where they didn't dare waste anything because they didn't have that luxury of being able to do so the way we can today. There's all sorts of reasons and motivations not to eat meat, but then others do because they enjoy it, they like it, they see it as part of a traditional culture, traditional offerings, a meal for the gods to which your human guests are invited will quite often involve serving up meat. So on a moral issue like vegetarianism, you'll get different opinions, different views in the modern world. There may well, for all we know, have been vegetarians amongst the ancient Scandinavian and Germanic tribes. Probably not enough for it to be remarked upon as a big issue by any of the writers, but, the odd person here or there may have done so. We don't really know. And I suspect a lot of people would have perhaps lived off a predominantly vegetable diet anyway, because in terms of accessibility and cheapness. We could think about the pagans of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, who again did not have carved in stone an exclusive set of moral values that every single Greek, every single Roman adhered to. What they did have, oddly enough carved in stone, are things like the maxims at the Delphic Oracle. 21 survive carved into the walls of what's left of the Delphic Oracle, but a lot of the walls have gone and crumbled away. And so we've got no idea how many were actually written on the missing parts of the wall, so there could have been a load more. These 21 moral guidances are things like all things in moderation, look after your elderly relatives, and so on, are exhortations on how to live a good life. They're not to be taken in the same way as the Ten Commandments in Christianity. So this isn't Apollo or some other deity saying, you must do this. This is simply philosophers recommending, if you want to live a good life, try doing it this way. It's suggestive rather than commanding. And a lot of what's written on the remaining walls of the temple is perfectly sound, sensible stuff that a great many people would agree is definitely worth adhering to. Friendship, it crops up a lot. That's a particularly strong theme amongst the Greeks. They did have a strong sense of family as well, but many Greek philosophers commented that to live a truly fulfilled and happy life, it's not so much romance and Mills and Boone, finding your one true love and all the kinds of things that we are quite concerned about in modern day culture. It's more having good friends. People who will not only value you, look after you, help you, support you, and vice versa, you help them, but also people who will challenge you, which is an interesting one. It's the idea that friends aren't all about kissing up to one another and sort of sycophantically agreeing. Rather the idea, which is repeated by different philosophers, that a truly good friend will point out to you when you're being a complete tit, so that you can stop being a complete tit, and they will help bring you back onto a path of good behaviour. That's the sign of a true friend, one who says, oi, you're getting a bit out your pram, you're being a bit silly, you need to stop what you're doing, rethink your life, as opposed to someone who just tells you everything you do and say and think is wonderful. So Facebook friends who only ever tell you you're marvellous and wonderful are not the Greek idea of friendship. It's the ones who pull you up that is the Greek idea of friendship. So that's an element worth reflecting on. And again, you had a whole variety of different moral standards. Things that were acceptable in ancient Greece, some of it would be horrifying and unacceptable nowadays, like slavery. The ancient Greek philosophers, some of the temples, all sorts of merchants and warriors and what have you, people owned slaves, male and female alike. That obviously is not something we would do anymore, but it was considered an acceptable practice back then. It's fairly prominently known that Greeks had quite different attitudes to issues of sexuality, were au fait with all sorts of relationships that later generations and subsequent religions, Christianity and Islam and so on, found very offensive and tried to eliminate, drive underground to the point of killing people, and that goes on, as depressingly we see on the news to this very day. But then again, the Greeks also tolerated some forms of sexual relationship that we in this day and age would be horrified by. So it's not just that they were super duper liberal, but also that there are other things that they got up to which we would not be comfortable with in this day and age. Likewise, the Romans. We could reflect at length on Egyptian morality amongst the Kemetic religion of ancient Egypt. We do have instructions surviving in the Amduat, the Book of the Dead, or if you prefer, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, which is a bit more appropriate for a title, really. Which was a whole set of papyrus scrolls. Like we say book, it kind of conjures up images of a modern style book. It's papyrus in that day and age, loads and loads of scrolls. To advise the dead on what to expect in the afterlife. Well, to advise those about to die on what to expect in the afterlife, that they would go to these gates and they would meet these creatures and they would be faced with a whole succession of challenges. And if they were fortunate enough to have relatives to make sure there were certain amulets and certain special objects wrapped up in the bandages of their mummified corpse, then these could be brought out and used as protective magical objects to get them through some of these gates, and eventually after a lot of kind of palaver, they would end up in the halls of Amanti, the place where the gods judged and assessed. So there would be the ibis-headed god Chihute, stood by the great scales, and the dead person would be brought forward, and because of the funeral processes involved, or how they preserved the body and so on, the heart was removed and had been placed in a canopic jar, a small jar. This would be presented to Chehute, who would take the heart, which was regarded as the seat of consciousness and morality and so on, and he would place it upon a set of scales, which were the manifestation of the goddess Ma'at, the goddess of order. In one side of the scale would be the feather of Ma'at, and in the other side of the scale they'd place the heart, and there would be a weighing process. Whilst the scales were up and down, sitting around this hall, probably looking something like the Wizengamot in Harry Potter, I rather imagine, but maybe a bit more eye makeup than that, but all sitting there in their august robes, were the 42 judges or assessors of the dead, one for each of the tribal districts of ancient Egypt, which is a whole story in itself, one for a different day. Each of these 42 tribal judges would say to the deceased person, "Have you done such and such a thing?" And that person would either have to say yes or no. And if they lied, the scales of judgment would reflect that they were lying. So they'd go through this succession of things, and some of it is stuff that we would share as a moral value today in the 21st century. Have you stolen? Have you lied? Have you murdered? Etc. Other parts of it involve things that we are much less likely to care about in this day and age. So, for example, saying very rude things about the pharaoh and being critical of the pharaoh was considered a no-go area. If we translate that into modern interpretations, and whoever the Prime Minister, President, King, Queen or whatever of your country happens to be, have you criticised them? Well, let's face it, a hell of a lot of people are going to say yes, aren't they? We would no longer regard that as some terrible sin, but to the Egyptians it was of much more concern. And there are some aspects of what was expected to be denied that are not really wholly applicable in the way we live our lives now, like stealing food from the temples. Back in the time when they would leave out food offerings from the gods, some people, presumably very hungry people, would sometimes sneak in and steal stuff. Generally speaking, we don't tend to leave much food offerings out anymore. Even within paganism, you might get the offering of a little bit of bread or a little bit of cake, but we are talking small quantities, not the kind of thing that anyone would break into your garden to steal off of your garden altar. So it's, as a moral virtue, it doesn't wholly apply anymore. And other parts that are quite just difficult to translate. They're words that no one's 100% sure what they mean anymore, so some of it is confusing. But there were 42 of them. So you could say that is a set of 42 moral guidelines, the Declaration of Innocence, that a pagan who follows the Egyptian gods, a Kemetic, might well wish to follow. But then again, some of these are open to interpretation, as I say. Some of them it's hard to see how they relate to modern life. So how many of them are realistically concrete, moral, ethical precepts for today? That's where we have region for debate. And I am about to stop talking very soon before all this food overboils and overcooks and you die of boredom. So we'll finish by reflecting on Druidry, which is the type of paganism I practice. Again, there is no carved in stone. You can't go along to Avebury or something and find carved into the rock a set of moral guidelines that the ancient British followed. What we have are values, ideas and concepts permeating the mythology. It's a mythology, if we're going to be realistic, that was recorded by monks, possibly the occasional nun, but mostly by monks. We could go down the line that some authors of fiction have gone down and suggest that some of these monks might have been druids before they became monks. Maybe so, in the very early days at least, but obviously as the centuries roll on that becomes less and less likely. Even when they are people who were born and bred Christians, we have to take into account that for many of them, their grannies, grandfathers, what have you, may well have been active pagans. So they may only be a generation or two removed from paganism. So when they're recording pagan mythology, they're recording something they have heard being told by relatives who might well still be alive, or by unconverted people in villages and what have you around Ireland and Wales and Scotland and so forth. And so they may be picking up on the moral standards that were current at the time. A lot of those who are very keen on recreating as closely as possible the history and the historical practices of ancient Britain, ancient Gaul, so forth, often place great emphasis on honour, the same way as the heathens do with the Scandinavian and Germanic roots. So that is a sort of a consistent element between those two approaches to paganism, that emphasis on personal honour and having a sense of self-dignity, not lowering yourself or cheapening yourself, but valuing yourself and obviously valuing other people in the process. Others take various other approaches and issues like vegetarianism and vivisection and should you smoke, should you drink, all the kinds of things like that. You'll get all sorts of mixed opinions on. What I want to leave you with is the personal stance which I take, and as do many of my friends who I practice my religion with, that there was a group in Ireland called the Fina. I say group, I'm not talking a pop group. The Fina were, if you imagine it, a bit like Robin Hood and the Merry Men, but in Ireland. Or if you prefer the A-Team with marginally less bling. They were a bunch of mercenaries. They could be hired to provide muscle power, so very much like the A-Team in that sense. But they also had a strong religious element to them, a strong spiritual element. Their leader, Finn, is described as being a druid and so on. So this isn't just a load of big burly warriors hiring out their muscle. They are associated with mysticism and tradition and all sorts of other magical, supernatural elements. And the various written accounts of them in the manuscripts that have survived talk about them having a motto which they followed, a set of guidelines, which is arranged as a 3-line verse. It doesn't rhyme, so it's not most people's idea of poetry, but a 3-line setup. Irish and Welsh law, a lot of it comes in sets of 3s. That's a popular way of arranging it. The 3 lines of moral standard that are followed by the Fina were truth in our hearts, strength in our hands, and fulfilment on our lips. Which is the aspiration I try to go by as well. In a nutshell, what the hell does that mean? A bit like the Wiccan Rede, you've got something that sounds simple, but the more you think about it, the more involved it becomes. Truth in our hearts is to know the truth in your heart, or your mind, if you prefer to put it like that way in modernised context. To know the truth about yourself, and as much as you reasonably can do, the truth about other people in the world around you. So it's to hold the truth in here, not necessarily to blurt it out, which is an important point. So you can keep secrets. You don't have to blurt stuff out. Also, it enables you to embrace things like diplomacy. So if you get the age-old question from your other half of, does my bum look big in this? You don't have to say, yes, love, you look like a beached whale. You can give a diplomatic, polite, but nonetheless honest response and say, oh, you look much nicer in that other thing you were wearing last night. So you can steer the person away from doing something you feel is unflattering to them or whatever, without hurting them in the process, because there are people, I'm sure many of you listeners will have met them, who love to use honesty as a weapon to bludgeon other people and hurt them. Oh, I absolutely had to say that because I'm always honest, and yes, I've left you in tears, but oh, I'm honest, that's just me. Yes, that's just you, you're an arsehole. And you're using honesty as an excuse to be cruel and sadistic and unpleasant. That is not an appropriate use of honesty. You can tell someone the truth about a situation in a kind and gentle way. You don't have to smash them over the head like it was a sledgehammer and use the truth as a weapon. That is unnecessary. And within Druidry, as I understand it at any rate, it's about being honest but not brutal, not cruel, not sadistic. So it's using the truth kindly rather than as a means to batter other people. And that the idea of knowing the truth within is also, if you know who you are, then you don't kid yourself. You might kid other people, possibly, but you don't kid yourself. So it's about not being self-deluded. In as much as any of us can truly know ourselves, that's a whole other question, though, isn't it? Strength in our hands, at one level, is a warrior's ethic. Pick up your sword, your axe, your shield, go onto the battlefield, rah, give it all of that. And you could leave it at just that, but it's not the way that I understand it. For me, the idea of strength in your hands is not about having big biceps. It's about facing your fears, whether that's in the field of battle as a soldier or a warrior, whether that's facing up to illness, whether that's facing up to bereavement, whether that's facing up to any one of a number of things that might terrify you or demoralise you. It's confronting those worries and anxieties and moving beyond them. So you do not live your life quaking in fear or be one of those poor people who gets to their deathbed and they've got a list as long as your arm of all the things they wish they'd done this, they wish they'd said that, they wish they'd been here, but they never dared do it. Oh, if only, if only, if only. What a sad moment to die on. It's better to get to your deathbed thinking, well, I know I made a bit of a fool of myself on a few occasions, but I'm glad I did this, I'm glad I went there, I'm glad I declared undying love to so-and-so, I'm glad I took the bull by the horns and lived life. Yes, I made mistakes, but I lived it. I wasn't this timid little shadow hiding in the corner, too scared to say boo to a goose. To me, that's what it's about, not having massive muscles and hitting people with axes. It's about overcoming fear, living your life in whatever way you want, doing the things you would like to do, even if they scare you. Last bit, nearly finished. I'll drink the remains of this gin after. You might want to do the same. Fulfillment on our lips is, I think, the most complicated of the three sections of that. It is the moral injunction found amongst the bards, the storytellers, the poets, etc., of Ireland and Wales and so forth, to speak out. To speak out in two contexts. Firstly, to condemn that which is wicked, that which is evil, that which is wrong. We know from various accounts and descriptions that one of the favourite methods of doing this was satire, to compose witty, funny, but very barbed poems and stories and things like that to essentially rip the piss out of people who are pompous and arrogant and overbearing and misusing their power. So for those of you who are of an age to remember Spitting Image and all of those puppets, or back to the days of the early satirical shows in the 60s with people like John Cleese and Ronnie Barker and so forth, a lot of that is about puncturing the pompous egos of the very powerful, the very influential, the very rich, and the very, very overbearing, who, a bit like the medieval kings with their hired court jesters, are often unwilling to have a mirror held up in front of them showing what they're doing wrong. So there's that. Why is that important? If you don't condemn that which is wicked, people think you approve. They take silence as tacit approval and they go on doing it. First problem. Second problem, if there are little children around, watching someone being horrible, looking at you and seeing you in deathly silence saying not a word, they will take it, again, that you approve of what this terrible person is doing, and they will grow up thinking that's an appropriate way to behave. And so, like a ripple in a pond, one person's awfulness spreads to other people and becomes imitated, because no one is standing up and saying, that's wrong. I don't approve of it. And you might, to start with, be one lone voice and they go, well, so what, you don't approve, I don't care. But if you have the courage to say, I don't approve, the next person and the next person and the next person, they might find their courage to join in and say, well, actually, I agree, I think it's wrong as well. And before you know it, there's a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand people saying, this is wrong. And then the mass of voices is capable of challenging corrupt power, misuse and abuse. And we're not really just talking about the rich and the influential. That could be the bloke that lives next door who's doing something awful and terrible that you are speaking out about. So that's worth going down. The other side of, I said two parts. One part is speaking out against wickedness. The other part is to speak out in praise. So the other angle, when they weren't writing rude satirical poems, they were writing praise poems, saying how wonderful and marvellous people were, or how beautiful the moon looked tonight, and all that kind of thing. Speaking out about that which is good. Again, why? If someone does something good and no one ever appears to notice it, all they get is stony silence, how long before they feel demoralised? Because often doing good involves making an effort. There's a philosopher called Lars Svensson who points out that evil is easy. It's very easy to be nasty and unpleasant. It doesn't require much effort to be a bit of a git. But it does require a lot of effort to be kind and caring and compassionate and patient and to go out of your way to help other people. So if you put in all of that effort and no one appears to notice or care, what incentive is there to keep trying? Something as simple as a small thank you and acknowledgement. I mean, I'm not talking showering them with gold, but some small acknowledgement that they've been noticed and appreciated encourages them to be good again on future occasions. And likewise, going back to the small children, if they're sitting around there watching someone doing something lovely and they see it being praised and acknowledged as lovely, it presents the role model. This is a good way to behave. Isn't so-and-so a lovely person for doing what they're doing? They're more likely to imitate it themselves and continue in that vein, rather than if they see no response whatsoever, why would they imitate something that no one reacts to? So that's worth reflecting on in and of itself. Makes that person feel good, makes others feel good, it improves the quality of society. I think that's more than enough waffle for one day. I'm not sure at this stage if there will be a part 5, because I may be running out of anything worthwhile to talk about unless anyone's got specific aspects of paganism they want to know about, or I can think of something I want to drone mindlessly on about whilst faffing in my kitchen. So I'll leave that there for the moment. There may or may not be a part 5. Thank you for sticking with it. Bye-bye.